Hey kid, keep your head up. Look on the bright side. The glass is half full. Keep calm and carry on. One poop in the butt is worth two in the hands. That wasn't one. Things around the world have felt, let's be honest, not great over the last few years. And some have accused us here at Wisecrack of being a little bit too bleak about the state of the world. But even with all this, America has at least managed to maintain a certain sense of cultural optimism.
We're the most unique country in the world. We're a product of possibility.
And this shouldn't be surprising, as America has always been an optimistic country.
Because we have great scientists now and their ideas about better tools, I'm actually quite optimistic about both.
Our main export, besides McDonald's and reality television, has been that peculiar thing called the American dream.
We can give everyone in this country a fair chance at that great American dream.
And our culture remains a hotbed of positivity, i.e., even if we don't feel good, a lot of us have a sense that we should feel better than we do. And luckily, there's a host of podcasts, products, gurus, apps, and services that promise to help us get there and be positive if we pay them money. Now, pessimism, on the other hand, has always been associated with the Eeyores and Darias of society. Those who are so afraid to fail that they never try, and who use their pessimism as an excuse to set expectations really low. Basically, the stoners, slackers, drifters, and burnouts of the world, aka my friends. Now, these days, we do see a version of this in climate doomerism, in which pessimism about the continued decline of the climate leads some folks to determine that everything is hopeless and there's no point in trying to make anything better, but more on that later. And while pessimism and optimism might seem like the oil and vinegar of attitudes towards life, some folks, like philosopher William James, think they can actually be reconciled. Which I guess is also true of oil and vinegar, because all you gotta do is add mustard to make those two enemies into a gorgeous vinaigrette. So, is there reason to be optimistic? Or pessimistic? Or, maybe more importantly, is the future destined to be good or bad? Do we have some say in the whole thing? And if so, can our mindset affect the outcome? Let's find out if it's actually positive to be negative or negative to be positive in this Wisecrack edition on optimism. What is it good for? But before we get into it, something I'm optimistic about is that you would have fun if you watched Wisecrack Live. That's our stream. It happens on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. It's a pretty fun time. We hang out. We do wisecracky things. We talk about culture. We analyze media. We watch fun videos on YouTube. We have a really fun chat. Wisecrack Live, Thursdays, 11 a.m. Pacific. I'll see you there. And now back to the show. Okay, so let's get started with American optimism. Where does it come from? Why are we like this? And is it doing us any good? Now, I've experienced this personally. When I moved to the UK in my early 20s, I immediately heard comments from British friends, or at least my optimistic American brain thought they were my friends, about how Americans were too happy, too cheery, and naively optimistic, whereas they were hardcore realists, without a tendency towards belief in magic or fate, except for when it applies to a magical inbred family ordained by the Protestant God to rule over you and take your money so that they can have fancy tea parties and breed corgis. And while they might be wrong about which side of the road to drive on, and if monarchy should exist in 2023, they seemed to be right about the particularity of American optimism. And this phenomenon has been observed by folks like Irish philosopher Charles Handy, quoted in an Atlantic essay as saying that anyone visiting America from Europe cannot fail to be struck by the energy, enthusiasm, and confidence in their country's future that he or she will meet among ordinary Americans, a pleasing contrast to the world-weary cynicism of much of Europe. Now, Handy said this in 2001, presumably on September 10th or earlier, but he's obviously not the first to think this. In fact, he observed this while retracing de Tocqueville's famous journey across America, where the 18th century writer came to some similar conclusions about the whole America thing. So where does our sunny American optimism come from? Well, one potential culprit is the American dream, the cultural mythos that explains everything from the heartwarming stories of immigrants creating new lives to the soul-destroying stories of manifest destiny. There is pretty good evidence that this dream has been a positive motivator for children of immigrants who, according to one study, have higher rates of upward mobility. It's also led to America being a nation of brave entrepreneurs and small business owners. Even during the recent recent economic downturn, Americans have still been starting businesses at a steady rate. And this optimism-laced mythos seems to be one of the last things in America, besides Tom Cruise flying airplanes fast, that those on both sides of the political divide can agree on. Barack Obama won the 2008 election with a rallying cry of hope, and some claim that this optimism was key to his victory. But soon after we were all drunk on hope,
Barack Obama, a man of color, has been elected to the highest office in the land, the President of the United States.
we were caught in the worst financial hangover since the Great Depression. And for some of us, we were also caught in a real hangover because, you don't get that alcoholism is all around you because it's been normalized. Step back and just ask yourself, is this good? And on the other side, during the early days of the COVID outbreak of 2020, Donald Trump predicted that the pandemic would be over by Easter of that year. Spoiler alert, it was not. Instead of a COVID-free Easter egg hunt, we faced multiple waves with more than 1 million Americans losing their lives. While some might blame this optimistic forecast on political calculation or cynicism, Trump does also seem to be an apostle of the Church of Optimism. His childhood pastor was the author of The Power of Positive Thinking and once wrote, "Affirm it, visualize it, believe it, and it'll actualize itself." I wonder if he ever bopped it as well. Anyone ever play Bop It? You get that reference? So maybe Trump was just affirming, visualizing, and believing that the once-in-a-century pandemic would just go away. But like many things associated with the category of good vibes, America's bipartisan optimism seems to be on the decline.
Oh, don't cry, are you?
According to the Pew Research Center, in 2019, most Americans expected a worsening political divide, a degraded environment, a weak economy, and growing inequality in 2050. In other words, my retirement is going to suck. On an individual scale, optimism may have some serious downside, besides just making you kind of insufferable to all your depressed friends. Studies have shown that optimism can make people unrealistic and likely to exhibit poor planning, save less money, and smoke cigarettes at higher rates. Because let's be honest, it takes a good amount of optimism to regularly ingest something known to cause cancer for 60 years, but you just tell yourself, "Now I'll be good." It's also the case that the general attitude of optimism and the expectation by optimists that good will prevail over evil, or that good events outweigh bad ones, might set them up for long-term disappointment. So maybe with everything we know about optimism, it just makes more sense to lean into its opposite, pessimism. Well, don't go painting your bedroom walls black yet, because pessimism and its most recent guise, Doomerism, isn't all dead dandelions and smashed roses either. We have a recent video on Doomerism you can check out, but the TLDR is that with the dual rise of economic and environmental instability, a lot of folks are taking a "we're all so why bother" stance, which risks a type of quietism that leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Check out the video if you want to learn more. There's a link in the description, but for today, we're here to be positive for once. So if both pessimism and optimism have their downsides, are we just in a both are worse kind of situation? Well, according to philosopher William James, not to be confused with my beloved grad school professor James Williams, it might actually boil down to the difference between two distinct types of temperament. According to James, the history of philosophy is to a great extent that of a certain clash of human temperaments. Of whatever temperament a professional philosopher is, he tries when philosophizing to sink the fact of his temperament. It loads the evidence for him one way or the other, making for a more sentimental or a more hard-hearted view of the universe. He trusts his temperament. Wanting a universe that suits it, he believes in any representation of the universe that does suit it. In other words, James thinks that our individual temperaments have a huge effect on the way we think about the world, i.e., they can lead to us favoring certain philosophical viewpoints. James goes further and breaks down philosophical temperaments into two lists. First, there is the tender-minded, which includes rationalistic, intellectualistic, idealistic, optimistic, religious, free willist, monistic, dogmatical. Second, we got the tough-minded, including empiricist, sensationalistic, materialistic, pessimistic, irreligious, fatalistic, pluralistic, and skeptical. Shout out which one you think you are in the comments. I'm going to say that I'm vaguely free willist with a dash of materialistic, so feel free to add a dash to yours if you want as well, but no more than 2. That's cheating. But basically, if, for example, you're a tough-minded person by temperament, according to James, you're likely to interpret the world in such a way as to lead you naturally towards a philosophy of hardcore cynicism, and vice versa. So for James, there aren't logical arguments for or against these temperaments. They're simply attitudes which serve as starting points, leading us to see the world in specific ways. They aren't theories of why the world is the way it is, but rather of why we tend to interpret the world in particular ways. Well, this is helpful for understanding why we we might have personal inclinations towards optimism or pessimism, it doesn't really help us figure out which of those positions, if any, is the most helpful. One third option might be, rather than feeling positive or negative about the future, we should simply cultivate a sense of detachment towards the future and not harbor any good or bad expectations about what might happen. But according to James, this is almost impossible, as it would contradict the very spirit of life to say that our minds must be indifferent and neutral in questions about that of the world's salvation. Anyone who pretends to be neutral writes himself down here as a fool and a sham. Another could be to approach things with a spirit of all things in moderation, finding a nice balance of both optimism and pessimism. But this still avoids the key question of, will the future be better or worse? James argues that there is, in fact, a productive third way between optimism and pessimism, what he calls meliorism, the belief that the world can be made better through human effort. He thinks meliorism can mediate between the tough and tender-minded attitudes, in large part because it's a critique of an idea common to both: fate. Meliorists dispute the idea of fate altogether, meaning it makes no sense to be a pure optimist or a radical doomer. The future isn't predetermined and doesn't follow any set pattern of necessity. It's contingent and can be shaped by human action. It's not that reason or purpose shapes the future, it's people doing stuff that does. Now, according to James, midway between the two, optimism and pessimism, there stands what may be called the doctrine of meliorism. Meliorism treats salvation as neither inevitable nor impossible. It treats it as a possibility, which becomes more and more of a probability the more numerous the actual conditions of salvation become. For James, meliorism is a consequence of his primary philosophical stance called pragmatism. That's another topic for another video, or something that you could just Google if you want to know more about right now. But you might be wondering, didn't you say this was going to be about American optimism? What happened to America? To which I would first say, indeed, what did happen to America? And then pump the brakes. I'm getting to it right now. Although we tend to think of America as inherently optimistic, it's a little more complicated, because one could argue that James's meliorism is a better description of the quintessential American mindset. That's because it's basically the same attitude that's made America the land of opportunity for the tired and huddled masses from all over the globe. People saw a better future in America, not because of fate, but because they thought the risk was worth it, and that they would have a better chance of creating their own future in the land of Budweiser and Wendy's. Meliorism is actually a pretty empowering way to think about the world, one that avoids the pitfalls of either optimism or pessimism, both of which are often guided largely by notions of fate or determinism. While you might object that pessimism, doomerism, skepticism, and cynicism are realistic and rational, these views can obscure the fact that most great human accomplishments are the result of people taking bold actions in the face of almost certain failure, from inventing electricity to fighting for civil rights. On the other hand, if we are just teleological optimists who think progress is inevitable, we forget that history is full of twists and turns and setbacks and lots of other bad stuff that we're not always fated to recover from. And ultimately, it's decisions and actions that shape the future, not just positive thinking. So following James, it seems that optimism may be too naive, and pessimism may be too cynical, but with meliorism, we can at least acknowledge that the future is a scary and unknowable thing. But it's our scary and unknowable thing to at least try and shape for the better. But hey, what do you guys think? Is the future ours to shape? Or are there forces both positive and negative outside of our control? Please let us know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much, as always, for your likes, your comments, your subscriptions, your attention. It means so much to us. And a huge special shout out to all our patrons for your support. If you haven't checked out our Patreon page in a while and you feel like getting some extra content while supporting the channel, maybe do it. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you later.